but we're going to try it on the computer and see what happens. I woke up this morning thinking about the Gettysburg Address because that's something that my brain does to me. I wake up thinking about that or about Beethoven or about art or about the scholastic debate or some other monumental thing. And then I figured, yeah, let's check out some stuff and research some things and maybe do a video. So I'm doing a video. And I don't claim here, just for the record, this is my caveat emptor, right, or my cave canem, might beware of the dog. As a caveat here, I don't claim to be an expert on Abraham Lincoln. I don't claim to be an expert on the Gettysburg Address. I don't even claim to be an expert really on speech writing. I just know a few things and thought I'd pass on some of my insights to you. Now, the first thing to note is that Abraham Lincoln had three great delivered addresses. There was early on in his career, there was the Lyceum Address, and there was the second inaugural address after he was elected the second time, and then there was the Gettysburg Address. And these stand as fantastic pieces of rhetoric. In fact, I would consider the Gettysburg Address to be probably one of the greatest pieces of rhetoric in the English language. It's fantastic and should, if it isn't still studied in schools and memorized in schools, it should be. But it is an excellent piece of rhetoric, and I'll show just a few reasons why I think this is the case. Lincoln was delivering this address in 1863, in November, I think it was. The Battle of Gettysburg that preceded this was back in July, 3 days in July, just before July 4th, which is celebrated as the birth of our nation, because the Declaration of Independence was published on July 4th. Well, it technically published on July 3rd, but it was amended and officially published on July 4th. So that was considered to be the celebration of our nation's independence from England. The battle was on the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd of July in 1863. And to put it into context, there's a great video from PragerU which shows you some stats on this. But to put it into contrast, Gettysburg was, if I'm not mistaken, the greatest loss of life on the battlefield in American history up to that point. It was a tremendous bit of carnage. And it was a really threatening battle, too, because it was the first time that Robert E. Lee, the head of the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederacy, had attempted to move the theater of war into the north. And so he had invaded Pennsylvania and was marching north to try and draw out the Union forces. And by accident, really by sheer accident, they ended up fighting there at Gettysburg, and the Army of Northern Virginia was smashed. Not completely, because they fought on for some time after that, but they were smashed. They were defeated and they fled south, and that was the end of Robert E. Lee's attempt to move the battle into the northern theater. All of the conflict was in the south, and that's one of the reasons why the land was so devastated in the south. But Lincoln had gathered there in November of 63 in order to help dedicate this battlefield to those men who had fallen there fighting in that conflict. And the guy who preceded him, who spoke before him, spoke for quite some time, about, I think, almost 2 hours, maybe more. But Lincoln, when he got up, he spoke very briefly. It was only 15 minutes, I think, maximum. I may be wrong in that, but please don't come after me if you're a scholar and you know these things. Just post in the comments and correct my idiocy. Lincoln spoke very briefly, and he's the one we remember. He's the one that we memorize his speech, because the speech is a fantastic example of rhetoric. Now, Lincoln was an artist in two areas. He was an artist in statecraft, and I still consider Lincoln's ability to hold the Union together during this conflict and his ability to get people to see his way of doing things through humor and cajoling is a masterful piece of artwork. If we consider statecraft an artwork, he was able to convince people very easily with humor and getting on the good side, and be able to win over people to his point of view without berating them or insulting them or anything. Master statesman. But he was also very good at rhetoric, at being able to speak publicly. It's said that Lincoln traveled around the circuit court judge route in his younger days, and he carried only two books with him, the complete works of Shakespeare and the King James Bible. And these two works kind of they honed his grammar, so he was able to think in those terms. But he was also very well studied in classical rhetoric. And what I mean by that is there was a time-honored structure for rhetoric, which is the referred to as the silver rhetoricae, the woods of rhetoric. And this had gone on into from Greek times into Roman times, from Roman times into medieval Europe, and from medieval Europe to the British system of education, and from the British system of education to the American system of education. They followed the same structural pattern of how to construct a speech that was powerful. And so Lincoln was himself steeped in that. And like I point out to my students, like any artist, he intentionally crafted his speeches using the knowledge that he had. He didn't just accidentally do this. He didn't accidentally throw words into the air and hope they came down, any more than the builder of Chartres Cathedral threw bricks in the air and hoped they'd come down as Chartres Cathedral. Excuse me for a minute. Yes.
Are you in mid-debauch?
I am in mid-debauch.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have dinner.
Okay, I'll be right there. Anyway, so like any artist, he did not just throw words up in the air. He intentionally created words as he needed them, or used words as he needed them. And that being the case, he was familiar with structures and patterns which are important to note, to point out. Now, I'm sharing the screen here and hoping this works. We'll see if this works when I move to this. This is the Battle of Gettysburg, just a Wikipedia as a quick source. Battle of Gettysburg was fought July 1st to 3rd on 1863. And it was the Union forces versus the Confederate forces. The Union, also referred to as the Federals. The Confederate forces, were from the South and led by Robert E. Lee. And the threat that was involved in this was that Robert E. Lee, had he succeeded at Gettysburg, there was no real force that could oppose his marching further south and into Washington, D.C. and taking Washington, D.C. So really, Gettysburg was a decisive battle. It was a battle that decided the fate of the Union. Had the Union lost at Gettysburg, as, by the way, they had been losing almost every major conflict prior to this when they faced the South, had they lost at Gettysburg, it is likely that Lee would have been able to invade Washington, D.C. Now, I am of the opinion, personally, that there was no way for the Confederacy to win. They didn't have the resources or the manpower or the infrastructure at all. But there was a possibility that the Confederacy could have fought the Union to a truce, to a standstill. And what that truce might have looked like is anybody's guess. But it probably would have involved the ability to secede and become a separate country. Now then, of course, I think the South would have split into various states and there would have been war between them. The Union would have dissolved. So it was a threat to the Union. And it was also a high possibility that the federal forces would then have had to appeal to other nations to help them out, Europe, for instance. So it was a crisis moment, to say the least. When we look at the battle, or when we look at the speech that Lincoln crafted, it plays off of this crisis between the federal forces and the Confederate forces. And why do I use that term? It's because really there was a crisis in American politics and American civilization, which stretched back to really before the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And this is a crisis of how we are going to form our government. Are we going to form it as a strong, centralized government, a federal government, or are we going to form it as a loose affiliation of like-minded states, which is a confederacy? If we form it as a federal government, we are emphasizing the idea that the central government holds these states together. And if we form it as a confederacy, we're emphasizing the state that these states are all like-minded until they're not, and then they drop like-mindedness. So Lincoln was really, in his speech, I think, pointing out this conflict that goes back to the before the Civil War and before even the Constitution. It is what is called in rhetoric a hortatory speech. Hortatory comes from Latin hortor and then through Middle French, hortatoire. And it's basically a speech that exhorts or gives advice, encouraging people to something. So in a hortatory speech, you try to encourage people to do something important. And in his speaking, Lincoln brings up what's called the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is a structural pattern for speeches or for composition or for artwork, which suggests that when you set things in series of three, you have a much stronger compositional piece. And he plays that against this other rule, which is pairing things up, where you have twos at a time. Now, his speech, using the rule of thirds, has what is called tricolon. Okay, tricolon. And tricolon is where three parallel elements of the same length occur together in a series. So, for instance, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, by Julius Caesar. In tricolos, which is three clauses, you set three things up together, and that plays off the rule of thirds. It sticks in the imagination, sticks in the head. But again, Lincoln uses duality as well. And why would he use duality and thirds, or tricolon, in the same speech? Well, partly because of rhetoric, but partly because I think he's trying to do something here in the speech, something kind of intriguing. Now, I'm looking at what's called the Silva Rhetoricae website. I find this to be a really fascinating website about the ancient art of rhetoric. And in this structure of a speech normally follows a regular pattern. I put it up here earlier, but normally there are three parts to a speech: an introduction, a body, and an ending. You tell them what you're going to tell them, you deliver the speech you promised, and you tell them what you told them. And that's following an Aristotelian three-act structure: a beginning, a middle, and an end. Lincoln does that to some degree. He has an introduction, a body, and an ending. But normally the body, as you hopefully can see here, the body is normally 70% of the speech. The introduction is 15, the ending is 15. When we look at Lincoln's speech, it's not structured that way. This is using the Bliss copy, by the way. There are, I think, 5 copies, five known copies of the speech in Lincoln's handwriting, each with a slightly different text. They're named for the people who first received them. So the Bliss copy here is what I'm referring to. Ever since Lincoln wrote it, this version has been the most often reproduced. So that's why I'm using it. The Bliss copy shows us that the bulk of the speech is actually the last part. He has the introduction, he has the middle section, he has the last part, which is called, by the way, in rhetoric, the peroratio. The peroration is the last part of the speech. And what's really noticeable here to anybody who writes speeches is that he skips some parts of the classical speech. Normally you have 6 parts. There's the exordium, the narratio, the partitio, the confirmatio, the refutatio, and the peroratio. The exordium, which is the first part, is the introduction. One announces the subject and purpose of the discourse. After that exordium, you have what's called the narratio, which is the second part. Here he provides a narrative account of what has happened and generally explains the nature of the case. Then you have the partitio, the partitio. The partitio is where the speaker outlines what will follow. The confirmatio is where he gives the main body of the speech and offers logical arguments. Then you have the refutatio, and the refutatio is where you basically you bring up counter arguments and you refute them. And then finally you end with the peroratio. And the peroratio is where you have appeals to pathos and you sum up the case. Now, what's really intriguing about this speech, if we go back to it, is that he has in here an exordium and a narratio, right? He has the exordium, which basically employs persuasive appeal of ethos to establish credibility with the audience as an introduction. And he has the narratio, which is where he brings up a narrative account of what has happened prior to this and explains the nature of the case. But what's fascinating is that this is the narratio. This is the exordium. Really, the narratio in his speech comes before the exordium. See, he puts this, what has happened prior, as the opening of his speech. It's the first thing in people's face. What has brought us to this point? Here it is. And then he goes on to say in his exordium, his second part, he says, this is the purpose of the discourse. This is why I'm speaking. This is why I am here. So he starts off by saying, this brought us to this point. Now we're here. He even uses the words. He even uses the word now. We are engaged in a great civil war. Now here we are in the Civil War, and we've come to dedicate this field. Now that's fascinating. Why he would twist it up, unless he knew what the real structure, what the traditional structure of a speech was, and was turning it or troping it intentionally so that his audience would hear that trope. That's fascinating to me. And then the last part, he skips completely the partitio, the confirmatio, and the refutatio. It doesn't even go into them. He then ends with the peroratio, which is the summing up, the appeal to pathos. And it's appeal, as he would say, to the higher angels of the spirit of his audience. So here we have, and the last part, the peroratio, which is where he exhorts people to action, calls them to action. And we'll look at what the action is here in a minute. Notice he's using a tricolon in a couple different places. He says here, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow. That's one form of tricolon. And then he draws that out, to say the dedication and the consecration were done by these men who died. And then he goes on to use another form of tricolon further on, where he says, we are highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. So that's another tricolon. I'm sorry, I put them out of order, but that's another tricolon. And then he has a third tricolon, which is tagged at the end of the speech, because this is what people will remember. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It's another tricolon. So he has 3 tricolons in his speech. Or tricolons, some people say. So I like tricolon, it's better and more French. Now, why would he do that? I think it's because he recognized that there's a certain magic in speechcraft. There's a certain magic in rhetoric. When you speak, you influence other people's minds. And you do so by using certain techniques. One of the techniques is where you have 3 threes. If you say a thing 3 times, it affects people. They remember it better. I don't know why, they just do. If you say a thing 3 times, it affects them even more, startlingly. Now, it's pointed out in several different analyses of the speech, particularly this one here. This is from Public Words, the greatest 250-word speech ever written. This is done by Nick Morgan. I'll put the link down here. But Morgan points out that Lincoln also repeats words throughout the text in order to cement them in the mind of his listeners. And he says, buried in the biblical phrasing, there's a further device that works unconsciously on the audience and the reader to weave some incantatory magic, right? Incantatory magic. No one ever spots it. Even Gary Wills, in his otherwise brilliant book on the speech Lincoln at Gettysburg, doesn't spot it. When they look, people notice that the word we is repeated 10 times. He repeats the word we 10 times. That's not unusual or surprising given that Lincoln was trying to rally the nation, right? The speech was all about we. But as Morgan says, what is unusual is the repetition of the word here. As a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, the brave men living and dead who struggled here, the world will little note nor longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us the living rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they fought here. It is rather for us to be here dedicated that we here highly resolve. 8 times in 250 words. 2 minutes, Lincoln invokes the place, the hallowed ground of Gettysburg, by repeating the word here. As a result, he weaves some kind of spell on listeners then and afterward that is not consciously noted, but unconsciously seems to have a powerful effect. Now, Morgan doesn't talk about what that effect is. What would that effect be that he's repeating that word here, right here, right here, right here? I conjecture this, and maybe I'm putting too much into Lincoln's mind, but what I conjecture is, going back to the speech, is that Lincoln sets up first, in the very opening, a problem between two ways of looking at the world. He then goes on to develop that by saying, this is what this has led to, this conflict, and this is why we're here now. But in the last, it's almost like he's saying, this right here is where we make our stand, right here, in the present, so that we can look towards the future, but we have to do this right now in the present. I think he was emphasizing that word here in order to show people that they, right in front of him, needed to be involved in this conflict. And what was that conflict about? And this is where I find this is truly masterful. And again, I want to preface what I'm about to point out here with the idea that artists never do anything accidentally. True artists don't. A master does not. When you listen to Charles Mingus, for instance, or you listen to Miles Davis, or you listen to Charlie Bird, they don't just toot horns randomly or play notes randomly. Duke Ellington does not just pound the keys randomly, hoping some tune will come out. They know what they're doing. They're intentional about it. Same thing with architects. When you look at a great architect, they don't just throw bricks in the air and hope that they come down as the Parthenon. You don't have a great painter going and slapping paint on a canvas and hoping that somehow he has a Mona Lisa. Same thing with statecraft and with rhetoric. You don't have somebody putting words on a page, as is normally said, on the back of an envelope as he's writing to the speech. There's this legend that Lincoln somehow was riding in a train to the speech, and he wrote this on the back of an envelope, and boom, there's that speech, almost as though to emphasize he was so good at speech crafting that he could just whip off the Gettysburg Address in the last few minutes. I suppose that's consolation for people that procrastinate and do their essays the night before they're due. I don't know. But it seems to me a terrible misread of how Lincoln operated. We now know, and I could put the links up here, we now know that there are drafts of this speech going back several weeks, maybe even months before, where he was working out how he was going to say what he had to say. I think he was moving from duality to tricolon, to trinity in his speech. Why? Because when you look at what those numbers actually do to us, how we think about them, duality is conflict. It's always conflict. You have yourself, which is unity. And as soon as you have something that's not yourself, you have to figure out how you're going to relate to it. How are you going to relate to the phone in front of you, or the dog on the floor, or your brother sitting across the room? And are you going to relate to them in an equitable way or in a combative way? And I think he's moving from that tension between two to a reconciliation which is three. Two is duality, three is community. And three represents a movement to an elevated idea, an elevated place, something greater than what we have now. If, for instance, you have conflict between two people, you try to get them to think about something greater than their conflict, and they can actually resolve their differences. Give them a pizza, for instance. Ask them whether they both think that a TV series is great. Ask them whether they both think that such and such a website is a pain in the neck. And suddenly they're thinking about something more than their conflict. They're moved beyond it. You're appealing to their higher angels. So really, when we're looking at his speech, he moves from conflict to a greater sense of what we're about, Trinity. And I think the conflict is brought up right here in the very beginning, because I think Lincoln was very aware, as many of the people of his time were, that this was a conflict not just between people who owned slaves and people who didn't. It was really a conflict between how we were going to rule ourselves. And it was a conflict that goes back to the very DNA of our nation, back in the Declaration and the Constitution that emerged from it. Let me point you to two phrases in his opening that illustrate this, I think. We normally gloss over this part, and we read it as one unit, somehow an example of the greatness of the founders. He says, a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And we see that as sort of a tip of the old stovepipe hat to the founders of the nation. But what if Lincoln knew, like everybody else, that the really key word in that opening is the word and. The word and. That's where the conflict lies. And here's why. If, for instance, the founding fathers said that liberty is what we're about, freedom, liberty, the right to define how we live with ourselves and our property, right? That's one aspect of the founding of our nation. In fact, when we say that endowed by their creator with the right to certain inalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Jefferson actually took that from a work by John Locke earlier. And John Locke phrases it differently, because John Locke says that people are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. See? So really, Jefferson was already thinking about the relationship between liberty and property. If you cannot do with your property what you want, liberty is itself an ephemera. It's a chimera. It's a vapor. It has no traction. We can talk about liberty all we want, but if the government can step in at any time and tell you, you cannot own this, you must own that, you have to sell this, you have to give that away, you don't actually have liberty at all. And they can take the next step then and also say, you have to do this with your own person, your own physical body. So liberty is really liberty over self and property. And what was the main source of property in the South in the antebellum years? It was humans, black men and women. That's a horrible thing. I mean, it's a horrible thing to think about, but that was the property of the men who owned these plantations. Now, it's a human travesty. Slavery is always a human travesty. But the entire economy of the South, because of the boom in cotton, due to the Cyrus McCormick's Reaper, the boom in cotton had allowed the South for the first time to almost be on an equal footing financially with these tremendously big banks in New York and Philadelphia. They were raking in money, and their whole economy was based on the plantation. And part of that plantation was the human labor that they owned. And they conceived of these men and women that worked their plantation as property. not as humans, but as property. And they even said these are 2/3 of a human each. One slave was 2/3 a human. Now, naturally, we are appalled at this. Our current reaction is to be appalled at it, and I think rightfully so. But you've got to think, how were they thinking? If you take away all the slaves of a plantation owner, how does he make his living? What would happen to the Southern economy? What would happen to a whole 50% of the nation? It would collapse. It would go under. They could not survive. So it wasn't just that they were cruel and liked to keep other humans under their heel. It's that they had got the bull by the horns. They had the wolf by the ears. And they could neither let it go nor hold on to it because it was chewing away at them. Go and read Jefferson's notes on Virginia. Jefferson makes this very clear. He owned slaves. He emancipated them right at the end of his life, but he himself owned slaves, and he said, I tremble when I consider that our God is a just God and that his justice will not sleep forever, referring to slavery. So if we're conceived in liberty as a nation, we're conceived in the idea that human beings, citizens, can do what they wish with themselves and their property. And that's a great concept. Only it had this terrible, 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 terrible tinge that property in the South was human labor, human bodies, human people. Now, you juxtapose that with the other major concept that led to the creation of this nation. And here's where Lincoln is, I think, establishing something that gives me chills to think about. If conceived in liberty, we're talking about Southerners, Confederates, who were fighting there at the Battle of Gettysburg because they did not want to be dictated to by a centralized government how they were going to live their lives and how they were going to deal with their property. You juxtapose that to the Federals, right? Because on the other hand, to this conceived in liberty was the other concept that formed our nation, which is a proposition that all men are created equal. All men are created equal. And by the way, I don't want to get into quibbles about whether or not it was white males or whether it was men and not women. That's silly. That's a right now, that's a dodge. Okay. We can come to it later if we want to, but not right now. Humans, dedicated to the proposition that all humans are created equal. And by that, we mean they have equal access to rights. They have equal dignity. They should be treated with equal respect. They should be given equal ability to live their lives as they see fit. That's a beautiful proposition. And it doesn't just mean white men. It means black slaves. It means other people from other nations that come to this country, men and women, old and young, infirm or not. That's what the proposition means. I think Lincoln knew that. I think he knew that implicitly. And I think what he was setting up here at the very start of his speech is that this proposition that all men are created equal is the proposition that's supported by the federal troops. They are fighting for the emancipation of other human beings, right? And if they didn't think that before, I think Lincoln intended that they think about it after this speech. He's framing how they are supposed to think about their conflict. And the conflict between all men being created equal and the conception of our nation and liberty is intense. Because how do you live your life the way you want and at the same time, right, say that everyone is equal? How do you put those two together? If I can live the life that I want, then I can't go make billions of dollars using slave labor or credit of other people or sweatshops or whatever. I can't do that. Well, why can't I do that? Because that's liberty, isn't it? But no, that's wrong because all men are created equal, and so on and so forth. And this constant conflict is really between the conceived in liberty and the dedicated to the proposition. How do we resolve it? I think he says then the resolve that we have is in that third part, the peroration. because this is the job for us. It's not to decide whether all men are created equal trumps liberty or whether liberty trumps all men are created equal. Rather, Lincoln says, it is for us to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. The unfinished work, it's not done yet. And they who fought here have thus far advanced it, but we're not at the place yet where we want to be. Right? We're not yet at that final resolution between liberty and the proposition. Okay? The crisis is so much that we don't know whether or not a nation so conceived and so dedicated both can long endure, because these two forces may tear us apart. We don't know. But we've come to dedicate a portion of that field for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. Now, I find it really interesting if you look at the speech. Nowhere does he talk about the fact that they're dedicating this to federal soldiers only. He doesn't say that in the speech. He may have implied it, but he doesn't say it. No, he says we're dedicating this as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. And we have to be dedicated, like the field is dedicated, we have to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. Well, what's the unfinished work? The unfinished work is, how do you reconcile liberty with the proposition that men are created equal? Because in times of crisis, we want to give over liberty and revert back to a tyranny, to an autocracy, to some strong man helping us out. And we're very ready to do it. And we could fall into chaos. How do you reconcile these two things? You know, it's a very difficult work. It is an unfinished work. It may be unfinished long after you and I die, and this video is long gone. But that's the task. That's what Lincoln says is the task. The task is not to destroy the Confederates. The task is not to tear down statues of the Confederates. The task is to figure out, how are we supposed to live? How are we going to reconcile liberty with this proposition? Because if we give up the one side, right, that all men are created equal, we might have liberty, but then we have very powerful men ruling over others. Some have liberty and some do not. If, on the other hand, we give up the concept of liberty, we might have the idea that all men are created equal, but that's a meaningless phrase because liberty is gone, you know. We may be equal, but those who want to pound us or take our stuff have an equal right to do it, and we can't stand up to them. Lincoln seems to be suggesting that the only way that we can escape this is by continuing in this tension between liberty and this proposition. And that tension should lead us to a higher pinnacle, which is discussion of how we are to do this. How do we resolve this? We resolve this in three ways. On the one hand, we dedicate ourselves to this great task, not by violence, not by yelling at each other, not by cussing and using bullhorns, but by discussion of how liberty and the proposition are supposed to be together. Second, we take devotion to that cause. It's not simply an academic game. It is vital that we decide this, or that we work towards a decision of it. Next, we highly resolve that those who have died didn't do so in vain. What if we forget all those people that died before us trying to hold these two pieces together? And we tear down the statues and we forget their names and we obliterate our history and we fall into a terrible, terrible, terrible dark age where nobody remembers anything about what has gone before. And then last, that there will be a new birth of freedom. It's a great phrase, a new birth of freedom. But that birth comes from the birthing pains that happened here at Gettysburg between liberty and this proposition. That birth of freedom has to occur in every individual that considers this. And only by this method, are we able to ensure that government of this kind, which is of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. If we relinquish liberty in order to make all men equal, some will be more equal than others. If we relinquish the proposition that all men are created equal in order to have liberty, some will have more liberty and license than others. You cannot get rid of the one without the other unless you completely give up the experiment. And then government of the people, by the people, and for the people will perish from the earth and will fall into a very, very, very dark age indeed. I think Lincoln understood this. And I think in this tremendous piece of rhetoric, he was not just tying together a nation or trying to tie the nation together again. He was illustrating that tension between liberty and the proposition and trying to move the entire nation's consciousness to a higher level of understanding about what we are as Americans. And that's why this speech is so tremendous, so great. Well, that ends it. And hopefully I was able to show you some of the things here. I don't know whether any of this worked or not. But if you were a Lincoln Scholar, hopefully this was enjoyable to you. If you're not a Lincoln Scholar, hopefully this will help you become one, because you should be. And if you have anything to add or anything to talk about with me, I'd feel very honored if you were to put something in the comments, and I'd be glad to respond to anything I can. I'll try to put up some of the links to the things that I mentioned here. And until we speak again, God bless you all. Take care, and my best to all you and your families. Good night.